Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ask a Professor, a UWM Anthropology web series where we ask professors questions about everything. My name is Pete Geraci. I'm a professional archaeologist and academic assistant for UWM Department of Anthropology. I will be your host, and today we are asking Professor Ingrid Jordt about the crisis in Myanmar. On February 1st of this year, the democratically elected leader of Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi, and members of her National League for Democracy were detained by force by the leader of the Myanmar military, Aung Hlaing. Since then, many people have been arrested, hurt, or killed while protesting the actions of the military, and the situation continues to worsen without a clear path to peace. In this episode, I hope to shed some light on the situation with the help of Dr. Ingrid Jordt, an expert in Myanmar politics. Dr. Jordt has conducted research in Myanmar since 1988. Her research interests include processes of political legitimation, lay monastic relations in Buddhist Burma, Buddhist meditation movements in Southeast Asia, and ethnographic methods in social theory. She has written several articles on the subject of Burma's political and cultural landscape, and her most recent article in the University of Notre Dame publication, Contending Modernities, expertly contextualizes the complexities of the ongoing political crisis. Hi, Ingrid. Thank you for being on the show. I'm excited you are here because when I first learned of the coup, I immediately wanted to know more about what was going on, and you are the perfect person to talk to about that.
Thanks, Pete. Thanks for having me, and thanks for giving a little bit of light on the situation in Myanmar. You're right. There's not a lot of information that we know about. We were talking a little bit earlier about our Myanmar. And so it's great to have this opportunity to discuss it.
So I noticed that you don't pronounce the R at the end. Is that the correct pronunciation then?
Right.
Okay. You notice that a lot of people on the news outlets don't pronounce it that way. Does that bother you?
No, it doesn't. Also, Aung San Suu Kyi is with a G on the end. People don't really have an idea about the spelling, and as you say, we don't know as much about Myanmar as maybe we could in our news, in our international news, and a lot of it gets distorted. And so I think that's part of our problem in thinking about Myanmar, is that we apply certain kinds of assumptions about what's taking place there. For example, the last 10 years, thinking about Myanmar's just transitioning to democracy, and the assumptions that we have, narratives that we hold as Westerners, that the world is moving towards democracy. And in fact, Myanmar has a very complicated history that doesn't necessarily include our teleologies of politics.
Right, yeah. And when I was doing research, I found that the idea of democracy there is very young, and their form of democracy is very different from ours. And I think we forget that democracy isn't the same over the world, isn't just one type of democracy. There are many.
That's true. Yeah.
So Ingrid, you've studied Myanmar for a long time. Were you surprised when you heard the news of the coup?
Not really. Myanmar has been in an unstable nation-state building process since 1948, when it achieved independence. And I think that the places where people have heard of Myanmar in the news recently in the last number of years has been with regard to the Rohingya genocide.
Right.
So it has been in our attention, but our understanding of it has been very complicated. Aung San Suu Kyi, who's a Nobel Prize winner, seemed to be not supporting the Rohingya, seemed to be not really taking up the mantle of human rights as people expected. And so there's a lot of confusion about how to interpret the processes, the political processes that are ongoing in Myanmar. So Aung San Suu Kyi herself is one of those locations for our misunderstandings, I think.
Right. And so in your latest article, you write about how Buddhist concepts such as karma and hapun influence the political process in Myanmar. Can you tell us what those concepts mean and how that system works?
Okay, so you drew on a couple of key terms that I'd written about. Pon is has to do with spiritual power, or the spiritual power it's usually associated with the male principle, not the female principle. The female principle is considered to be polluting and can actually take away the male power. But in any case, this idea of spiritual power or pawn is something that is seen to in the person of the sovereign, especially in traditional ideas about political sovereignty and ideas about authority that come from prior notions, pre-colonial notions that have to do with kingship. So if you think of a political system which is embedded in Buddhist ideas, in which karma is a central idea, then you see that the rise and fall of a person's power, of a country's, of the rise of a nation or of a kingdom, and the fall of that nation or kingdom is something that is seen as part of a cyclical history. It's an idea about time. It's an idea about causality. And for Myanmar, the idea about right now in this moment when we try to interpret what is happening, the article that you were referring to and that I wrote about was to discuss how there really is a competition between two ideas of sovereignty in Myanmar right now. And one has to do with the familiar one, the one that we're familiar with, democratic sovereignty and the principle of the sovereignty of the people. And the other has to do with the sovereignty of the ruler, of the authoritarian figure. And Min Aung Hlaing is the person who is the head of the Tatmadaw military, and he has been the leader of this military coup. And he's also had this this kind of relationship with Aung San Suu Kyi that's been very competitive, and a kind of struggle that they've had on a personal level, as much as one that represents a struggle between the military and the civilian governments, the civilian parts of government. And so their kind of struggle is, if you're going to interpret politics, you're going to see there are many layers at which you can understand the reasons for the coup. And one of them was that Min Aung Hlaing was, after the last election in 2020, in November of 2020, the military proxy party, the USDP, did not win the necessary votes to have a decisive role in the government. The military has already reserved for itself 25% of the seats of the parliament, but they were poised to go into the post-election period here beginning in February. In fact, they staged the coup exactly on the first day of the parliament coming into session. Was that it was the moment in which the NLD party and Aung San Suu Kyi had actually won back enough seats that they may have been able to start making real changes in the constitution that may have put the military kind of back into the barracks, or that this has kind of been the goal of the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi. The idea has been, how do we contain the military first within a civilian government so that we can then go about addressing problems of the ethnic minorities. But that kind of postponing, taking care of the ethnic minorities for a time later down the road, has meant that she has actually sacrificed some of the human rights principles that we had thought she was the sort of beacon of light, or for. Mm-hmm. So that's been trying to sort of break apart some of the complexity of so many perspectives from which you can read this. So some of them democratic, some of them autocratic, and Min Aung Hlaing is someone who sees himself perhaps as a kind of king who is coming in to rule as the sole sovereign of the nation state for the military.
And he feels justified doing that because he has the power to do that, right? He has control over the military, which has weapons and vehicles and resources. And I think correct me if I'm wrong, that kind of gives him the self-power to feel like he does belong in that place, right?
Well, he certainly does have a 500,000 strong military that is willing to be unquestioning in its willingness to follow whatever the generals tell them to do. And so he has used that to make a claim for being the sole power. You know, one should say that there's a second tier of generals underneath him. There are other members, but at this point, he's supported in the kind of military top-down structure. If he should end up failing, if the social movements and the civil disobedience movements end up looking like they're going to have an impact on the situation and really maybe bring the country down to its knees in terms of its ability to function, then it's possible that you might see a palace coup inside of the military. But at this point, it doesn't look good for that.
So let's go back just a little bit, and can you tell me how Aung San Suu Kyi came to power in the first place?
How she came to power in the first place? You mean in terms of the elections?
Yeah, well, I think in one of your previous articles, you talked about after the cyclone Nargis happened, there was some political instability, and then that may have given her some opportunity to be to come into power, correct? To be elected into power, is that right?
The best way to talk about it, and again, I've been speaking with you more about the democracy process because that's one frame that we're familiar with, and it is a frame that's taking place. They had elections in 2020, they had them in 2015, right. But I think that what you're getting to is this question that I've had about where power comes from and where political authority comes from in more Burma, which is the majority ethnic group, Burma Buddhist ideas about power. And one of the things that I've argued is that the prior military regime under General Than Shwe, the one that we're familiar with, the Saffron Revolution in 2007, which was, and then just a few months later, Cyclone Nargis hit. And that was something that certainly in the international attention would be maybe markers that we would see as things that had happened in Burma or Myanmar, is that the Saffron Revolution, which was monks who were striking against the military, basically excommunicating the military, had turned the bowl over. It's considered, you turn the alms bowl over means that you're not accepting the alms of the military. And by doing that, they were basically taking away not only the symbolic power that they give legitimacy to the regime from the Buddhist side, but also the actual power by removing the place where you can generate karma, by giving donations, and so when the military brutally cracked down on the monks, killing some monks, disrobing monks, putting them in prison, it really galvanized the society against the military. It was the general was called Monk Killer Than Shwe, and even though they had managed to suppress the resistance, the popular uprising, there was, for the first time, you started seeing like graffiti on walls, and you'd see dogs walking around with a sign with the name of the general hung around their neck. So there are all these kinds of protests that were still kind of guerrilla underground stuff. And then Nargis hit. It was, an absolute humanitarian crisis of a proportion that modern Burma had never seen before. And from the point of view of the popular kind of popular beliefs, or through the kind of Buddhist ideas about interpreting what this storm meant and what it meant about what it meant about General Than Shwe was that it was seen as a repudiation of his power. Right. That really a king is someone, or a ruler is someone whose power is aligned with the weather, it's aligned with natural forces. And so when there's something that is that fantastically, goes so fantastically wrong as the storm that Nargis was, where so many people were killed, it was seen as a repudiation of his political authority. And just to give you an idea, you can say, well, you're just saying that about the idea that nature is aligned with power. But just to show you that while I was in Burma, that one of the things that you would see in the newspaper every day was the weather report, which was the weather will be fair throughout the land. And that was the weather, because it was an alignment of the military's regime, which, again, to have everything be going well, to supporting the religion, to have sunny days, to have good rain when you need it for the crops, this was seen as a karmic unfolding of your legitimacy. It was a demonstration of your legitimacy.
I mean, religion and politics are close bedfellows. They always have been, in my opinion. And we like to think here in America, our politics and religion are separated, but that's not really true either. But I think in the case of Myanmar, it's very clear, and you can draw direct lines, sometimes, like you're saying, turning over the bowl in the monastic culture in that country and how much influence they have on the events that take place in there. Now, you mentioned, natural disasters. We're going through one right now. We're going through COVID-19. Do you think the COVID-19 pandemic has had similar effects as the Cyclone Nargis?
No, I don't. Cyclone Nargis just hit, the Irrawaddy Delta. COVID-19's hit the whole world. This isn't a repudiation of a particular person. This might be viewed in a Buddhist way as a kind of cyclic kind of moral degeneration of the world.
Oh, okay. Yeah. They're taking a whole worldview of that thing, and maybe they might be right. I just read an article about how, there's a very small percentage of the world that's been untouched by humans today, and that they're finding microplastics on top of Mount Everest and in the bottom of the ocean. So there really hasn't been a part of this world, and talking about the natural aspects of the religion and how everything is connected. I could definitely see how they could see that as a repudiation of our behavior. So that's really interesting. As I mentioned before, if political power is so closely related to the concept of Buddhism, how do people who are not Buddhists get representation in the country?
So when you're thinking of getting represented, I guess you're speaking in some ways from the idea of a democratic representation. That's sort of built into the assumptions that we have.
Or at least some agency in what happens in your life, right? I think representation is an overgeneralized word. I think what I meant to say is, how do people have a say over their lives when they're working in this system that they may not believe in?
So these aren't kind of monolithic in the way that we might think of it. There are, for the ethnic minorities, there are shared concepts about power, about patron-client relations, and about how networks and donations work. There are many ways in which there can be shared locations for the engagements between the central government. But that said, one of the things that is very toxic about Myanmar is that it has been trying to build a nation-state idea, which is trying to unify the nation along the lines of a Burma Buddhist majority, which means they've taken what was in 11th century a Shokin kingship model idea of conquer, pacify, convert, to the ethnic areas. And they have tried to incorporate the ethnics in a hierarchy of kind of racial categories, which has resulted in a toxic citizenship regime. There are first-class citizens, there are second-class citizens, and depending on your card, you can't move around the country. And that's even if you've lived in the country for, you've had family there for 5 or 6 generations going back. These are inheritance of 19th century British colonial ideas about ethnicity and race. But when you think about what it means to be involved in a citizenship regime that's based on this toxic Burma Buddhist idea, you can see how peoples like the Rohingya can be seen as not belonging to the country. And then as far as how they get represented, when you are seen as a non-person, as a person who doesn't belong, you don't actually have a social contract in which you can negotiate your citizen. There's not even a place that you can have a disobedience to refute. You're just, as a stateless person, you're a non-entity that actually can't negotiate or can't be represented. And so groups like the Rohingya, but there are others, Kachin and Karen, there are so many ethnic groups that have been, so many people in IDP camps, so many this ongoing civil war since 1948. But Rohingya people, especially, who are stateless, who've been expelled from the country, who've experienced genocide, really show the worst way in which this toxic citizenship regime works.
And the Rohingya, they are Muslim, is that correct? Or are they just Muslim, or they other religions too, or is that just?
I mean, they're predominantly Muslim, but there are also other Muslim ethnic groups within Myanmar that are accepted by the Burma
I see.
majority as being citizens. So again, a kind of graded citizenship that has treated the ethnic minorities as hierarchically relating to the sender.
Is that kind of similar? Because Myanmar, it's a really large country, and it has a really long north-south axis, and it's between India and China, and then you have the Southeastern Asian countries to the east of it, right? And so I would imagine that there are people from all over Asia living in Myanmar. So it's a fascinating kind of melting pot of that area to me. But what you're saying is that outsiders really aren't welcome, at least not right now, especially some particular outsiders, right? Or are the Rohingya actually indigenous to that area, or did they come from another area?
Well, the nation state boundaries were established by British colonials, and this was never a natural polity. So it used to be that the borders were pretty fluid. People were moving across borders all the time, and there are hundreds of different languages. So even if the lowland Burmans have been the majority population, all on the borders, you have these frontier regions that have never had that have never been sort of tied statically to land. But once you've got the idea of nation states, then each group is trying to figure out how to legitimize themselves in terms of those criteria. So the Rohingya have moved in from Bangladesh back and forth, and also you had the British who had brought in so many Indians because it's at one point, as you probably know, Burma was under Indian administration, under British colonialism, and so they brought in Indians in order to fill the administrative corps. From the central Burman point of view, they have constantly been inundated by populations, Chinese populations, Indian populations, through colonialism that have really displaced the Burma majority, displaced them from land. In Mandalay, the Chinese metropolis basically expelled local Burmese to the outside areas. And so those kinds of displacements have a role to play in the ways in which Burma Buddhist idea about what the nation should be is reactive to having constantly been displaced, having people constantly taking over taking over the economy, taking over the land. And now you have the military doing that toward its own group, its own people. And so it's just been a constant struggle of repression and constant having things taken away from you, land and resources, and nationalization of the economy. And so we're looking at a fairly long process here that's a traumatic process. And I think that there's real trauma for all of the groups in Myanmar.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like, sounds like a similar story we hear all over the world, right? From this post-colonial, blowback essentially. And after World War II, when there was even more kind of a super colonialism, effort in a way by certain countries like the United States and Britain, who were trying to shore up, strategic outposts around the world. Like we're involved in the Philippines, and we have interest all over the world. And, when you look at Central and South America, particularly, you have lots of coups and you have lots of revolutions, and it seems to be because, you have these groups of people who are kind of stuck in these boundaries, and they need to and they're being forced to get along with each other and to form some kind of identity. But creating identity like that, it takes a long time. I mean, look at America. It's 200 something years after our revolution, and we still don't know who we are as a people. We're still trying to figure that out.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think that part of the discourse in Burma at this point, and I think after the coup, has really been amplified, is the distinction between a federal democracy and a national democracy of the majority. And that has demonstrated that there are new kinds of ideas that weren't being pushed forward by Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD, who saw themselves as being face to face with the military, and that's where their conflict was. That's where they saw the power that they had to overcome. And because they were locked in that power struggle, they weren't really addressing some of the other things that had to do with a gerontocratic control over the government, which was that the young people actually don't have a voice. And young people coming up through the system, there's nobody to replace Aung San Suu Kyi. She's in her 70s. So you still have that same model of an elite politics. And Aung San Suu Kyi's father was the head of the military. He's the father of the nation. So you have the same perpetuation of one strand of nationalism. And a new kind of nationalism is maybe emerging. And that is one in which the protesters in this, the anti-coup protesters, especially what's called Gen Z, this generation, the first Gujarati literate, generation, that they are conceiving and pushing the politics against the military right now in terms of this more inclusive, human rights-based, democracy-based idea of a federal democracy. And that's something I think that's really changing the dynamics on the ground and moving it away from the discourse of whether these rulers are being good Buddhist leaders or not, because that's been the only terms for nationalism in the discourse of uprisings since 1947.
So after General Hlaing ordered the Tatmadaw to detain the state counselor Aung San Suu Kyi, what was the immediate fallout, and where do you see things going?
So the immediate response was this this large-scale social disobedience, the civil disobedience movement, and at the same time also Gen Z protest forms that were demonstrations in the street, which were that were really different from other kinds of protests we've seen before in Myanmar. Whereas in the past, the way that protests were situated were usually just in location-wise, were associated with the largest pagoda in the country. So nationalism and Buddhism and fighting against, being the opposition against the military was always done in these Buddhist terms. But here, what we saw was a most unusual kind of protest form, more what we're familiar with when we look at social movements globally. Young people who were making protests as much about gender, about cultural revolution, as much as political revolution. So, gay parades, and you had people just, protesting, and because they had snakes, they were carrying snakes, or they were carrying, they had dogs, or they were dressed like Superman, or they were dressed like Moana, or, so it was kind of, weebs and femboys, and it was in a kind of amazing array that was underlining the idea of of being the voice of a people that was diverse in a way that we hadn't seen in traditional protests. So what's been happening? A civil disobedience movement has been happening. It happened with strikes that were taking place in a number of locations, in the trade unions, the garment factories, the various industries, but mainly also the civil service groups, also professional groups like.
I just saw that nurses went on strike, or not nurses, medics, or.
Yes. They were some of the first. They were the first. And another thing that's characteristic of this movement is that they've tried to keep it pretty much a movement that is leaderless, because they haven't wanted it to be captured by one political party. And so in that sense, we are really seeing a society against the military state that's moving. It looks a lot more like, anti-apartheid protests in South Africa, but it's a long slog. So, where do I see it going? We've seen a lot happen in the last 2.5 months. We have the CRPH, which was the committee representing the Pidangzu Hluta, which is the parliament. 14 members that were not put in prison, that were elected, went underground, and they had recently, on April 1st, formed the National Unity Government, which also brought in civil society groups. It brought in the ethnic groups, and have declared the Tatmadaw a terrorist organization. They're trying to figure out how to create an ethnic and national army that will be. Now, all of those movements, the call by older civil rights veterans, like from the '88 uprisings, I was also there for that. Minko 9 has broadcast to people from the underground, from the border areas, that people should leave if you want to join the movement, that you should come out to the border areas, that they're going to call them a kind of free zone, and that these territories will then become the location for ethnic armies to join with the Burman majorities who are going to then fight against the military, and that the people who do stay have to continue with guerrilla warfare. So there are a lot of movements. There's this civil disobedience. There's a beginning of a kind of guerrilla idea of an urban movement. There's this moving to the outside. There's gaining the ethnic minorities, joining them together. So I think we're seeing a huge change in that we see a really large scale movement taking place. There's real mass resistance. It's a popular uprising. The Tatmadaw is really being seen as isolated. But that said, there are a lot of people who are associated with the Tatmadaw.
Right, you mentioned that they're 500,000 strong. Is that correct?
That's what's said. There's a lot of inflation in those numbers. It's said because there's a lot of ghost soldiers, people who've died that still stay in the ranks. It's not really known how large they are, but just to give you an interesting statistic, it is just about as large as the monkhood. So it's kind of an interesting way in which these mirror each other. But in any case, the legitimacy of the Tatmadaw in doing this is really been undercut in terms of the fact that the civil disobedience movement and the Generation Z are not talking on the level of Buddhism. They're not making this a discourse about whether you've actually been a good king or supported the religion. And that's also something new, because the military has actually been on the back foot. They haven't controlled the narrative, and they're to play catch up. And so that's a change in the dynamics on the ground.
Do you have any friends or colleagues there? Do you know if they're all right?
Yeah, I do. Some have left the country. Some have lived there a long time, are sort of slowly trying to pack up and get out, but are taking a little longer at it. And interestingly, while some of my friends will say, well, it's all right, I'm packing up, I'm doing it slowly, I'm going to get there, and tonight I'm going to go to the gym again. And, their lives are still kind of going on. There's pockets. And then others, like in the monastery, they're saying all night long they were shooting all around, and they're looting, and they're breaking into people's houses, and what can be done, and calling you at 2 a.m, what can be done, and how are we going to deal with this? It's really different neighborhoods by neighborhood in Myanmar.
Yeah.
And so people are being affected in different ways.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. So what do you think the international community can do about this crisis? Can they buy influence through charitable giving? Can they threaten violence? Or are sanctions their only choice?
The ongoing problem for Burma, how to address this from the outside. And nobody's willing to undertake another land war in Southeast Asia, that's for sure.
We're just getting out. We're just trying to get out of one, right?
Right. So the sanctions that had taken place after '88 had really not been, or after 1990 had really not been very effective. They basically crippled the ordinary economy the ordinary people were involved in, and the military was still able to do quite well, thank you. They've tried now to shift to targeted sanctions by being able to identify the generals and the people within the kleptocracy who has been involved in crimes against humanity, in financial crimes, and political crimes. I mean, it is a narco state. It's a kleptocracy, it's a narco state, it's a mafia state, it's a counterintelligence state. This is George Orwell straight up. It's no wonder that George Orwell was a police officer there, in the 1920s. His 1984 and his Animal Farm, I mean, they could come straight out of Burma. And in fact, in Burma, they call him the prophet. So it's an extremely, over time, the military has learned how to suppress the society in greater and greater ways. And so, in a sense, what can we do? What can be done? I think that really you first have to understand. You have to change the narrative by understanding the narrative. So you can't. You have to understand how autocratic power is maintained there domestically, and that's what I've been involved in my writing, to understand how the hegemonic system there is a Buddhist hegemony, a nationalist Buddhist hegemony, which the Tatmadaw has shaped. The problem is that when we come in as international press or international viewers, especially from the journalistic side, is that they often buy up the Tatmadaw's version and they plug it into their own international discourses, like that has to do with like the New York Times or Time magazine that plugged in as the country was just opening up, after all, not having even been in a democracy for decades, and framed it as a kind of militant Buddhism, xenophobic Buddhism, a kind of nationalist Buddhism that plugged into ideas about religious terror in the world. And so it was a kind of religion against secularism argument. And so these kinds of discourses actually are not resonant there, and they don't really explain how political legitimacy takes place. And it furthers the narrative that the military is trying to put out there, because they are trying to discredit Aung San Suu Kyi, and they are trying to establish a kind of nationalism that's based out of the fear that Buddhism is going to be destroyed, which is very operant in people's minds. So what we need to do, what would be helpful, is to understand how the military maintains itself economically, how the different corporations and stakeholders in corporations are bought into the military, keep them in power, and also how the governments like the United States, like Britain, like Thailand, like India, can do their part to help support the legitimacy of the national unity government and treat the Tatmadaw as not someone who should be coming to the table to decide how things should unfold for the country, but to see them as an illegitimate force.
Okay, so just to do a little pretending here, if you were, the UN secretary, or if you had some kind of influence in the political process, where would you start? How would you begin to address this problem?
Well, at this point, I think that it's about information, getting information. We don't know enough about where the money flows come in. I mean, $1 billion was blocked from leaving American banks by Biden's administration when the military tried to take it out, like February 2nd or February 3rd. That was the right thing to do, to be aware, to know that money now should be distributed to the NUG, should be made available to the NUG, so that they can actually get the resources that they need to be able to continue with civil disobedience, to support people, to get satellite access so that people can go around the military's telecommunication systems. Those kinds of things would be the most strategic, aside from the UN discourses about, legitimacy of this regime. Problem is that, in the we have China and Russia and the Security Council that are constantly blocking. Russia's just recently come and is selling more weapons to the military. So if this isn't taken care of, though, by India and Thailand and the United States and other regional players, ASEAN, for example, if they don't get involved now, then we're going to see Burma become a place that can be the location for a lot more conflict regionally over time, because China they have their gas fields in the south in Burma. They have their and a lot of the resistance movement is anti-China because of the domination in the region. So if you can imagine, one of the things that came out of this protest form was that it connected to other regional protests. It connected to the Hong Kong protest, to the Taiwan protest, to the Thailand protest. It's called the Milk Tea Alliance. And the Milk Tea Alliance is actually a way of addressing Chinese hegemony in the region. So those things start to build up. And on the ground, people have refused to even buy Chinese vegetables. That the trucks are being sent back. People aren't buying. So this movement can actually grow, and it can actually exacerbate global kind of politics in the region.
Well,
so we need to do something there. I think
yeah.
point of view out to push our to push these state makers and key players to get involved.
Well, thank you again, Ingrid, for giving us such a great overview of the events taking place in Myanmar. I know that I've learned a lot just in this past hour. But before we leave, are there any ways in which our viewers can help? Are there places to donate, petitions to sign, that sort of thing?
So it's an interesting problem. I will say that Mutual Aid Myanmar has been effective. It's organized by 3 academics, Tum Yuen at Carleton College and James Scott at Yale, and then Chayan Vadan Putti at Chiang Mai University. So kind of scholar activism, but the idea is that all the funds go through networks that are local networks to supporting civil disobedience movements, so nonviolent movements on the ground. So that's called Mutual Aid Myanmar, and I can give you the link to it.
Okay.
But one of the problems is that the military is really good at finding out where these monies move through. When I don't know if you remember when we had Cyclone Nargis, I set up Burma Rescue, which was a way of trying to get resources into people in the Delta when the military was blocking aid organizations from coming in. And the way that we did it was all through word of mouth. Through we routed money through Singapore. We routed it through the border. We even had 60-year-old ladies on motorcycles carrying cash in their motorcycle seat to people in the region so that they could help them. That was the level at which we had to bring in resources, because the military is always taking the biggest leader and decapitating them. So there's no, ability to keep these things moving forward. But I think this is getting through, again, because of local networks.
Well, thank you again. And that is all for this episode of Ask a Professor. For more videos and information about our program, please follow us on social media or visit us at uwm.edu/anthropology.